Going to get started, and we're going to do so by introducing ourselves. When we introduce ourselves, you might also hear us describe ourselves, and we do this just to be inclusive of those who are joining or viewing this later that are visually impaired. So I'm going to get started. My name is Chisom Udeze. I am the founder of Diversify. I am also an economist and overall diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice enthusiast. Really happy to be having this conversation today. It's a topic that's very close to my heart and one that I've been waiting to unpack. Just to describe myself visually, I am a Black woman with a roundish face. I am wearing a off-white beret and a off-white sweater, I guess, and a multi-print shirt, what you can at least see on the screen. And my background is pretty bland. It is just like an off-white background as well. So yeah, that's me. I'm gonna ask Danny to introduce himself.
Hi.
My pronouns are she, her. Yeah, sorry, Danny, go.
No apologies. My name is Pierre-Louis. I am originally from Brooklyn, New York. I moved to Norway about 5 years ago. I am a human resource manager. I also currently am a founder of an organization called Complete Connection Consulting, where I provide help and support and services to migrant workers here in Norway that are looking to assimilate into the work life. We provide services around CVs, cover letters, and also LinkedIn trainings. For me, I am wearing a bright green sweater with a white button up. My background is yellow. I've never had to describe my face before. I guess it is round with a bit of an oval shape to it. I am sporting a fade cut, like a fade, yeah. My background is yellow, so there's a lot of colors. Yeah, and my pronouns is he, him.
Thanks, Danny. Michael?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. My name is Michael Adade. I am a Londoner and been in Norway 5 years. Currently, I work in hospitality in Norway's newest luxury hotel here in Oslo. And I've been doing that since its inception in September. Previously, I have an economics degree and trained lawyer back in the UK. I am a father as well to two young children, two biracial children being brought up here in Norway, but they were born in London. Likewise, I'm very rarely asked to describe my face. I'd like to say I have chiseled looks, but I just have some stubble. I'm a Black man. I'm wearing my glasses today, blue glasses. I'm not wearing contact lenses, and I'm letting my hair grow out. I am wearing a blue jumper and a gilet, like a venture capitalist on holiday. I'm sorry for that. And my background is, I'm actually here at HerSpace. It's a beige background and provides a good contrast to my melanin rich skin, as they say here in Norway, melanin rich. And I'm really looking forward to today's discussion and hopefully lots of questions and feedback.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Michael. All right, so we're going to jump right in. Today, like I said earlier, we're covering race and masculinity, which are massive topics. I think we can take on race on its own and probably masculinity on its own. But today we're trying to explore the intersection of race and masculinity and how it also connects with themes like toxic masculinity, hypermasculinity, and also other identities, you know, like sexual orientation, culture, background, religion, and what have you. So really excited for this. So I'm going to jump right in. I will start with Michael. Michael, so what does masculinity mean to you? And how do you think it is compounded by your race or your understanding of toxic masculinity or hypermasculinity?
So masculinity to me comes in sort of two phases in my life. The one before I became a father and I guess an adult, and then when I was someone's son, you know, I lived at home with my parents. My parents both come from the same country, a West African background, where in my parents' generation, at least, women were submissive. The husband sort of leads the home, decides what happens financially, decides, you know, how the children be brought up, etc. So I was very much used to the man of the house making decisions. There was no shared equity in decision making. And that had an effect on the way I related to my younger sister, for example, and at school with friends. But that quickly changed, I guess, when you go to school. I actually went to a boys' school, so in some senses that it heightened the masculinity. Went to a boys' school where the main sport was rugby, for example, which is again very hyper masculine. So there's these ideas about what makes a man. It's a lot of physical toughness. Even when you're in pain, you don't cry. And I remember actually growing up in an African family, or my African family, if you did hurt yourself, broke a bone or something, I'm pretty sure I broke a few bones growing up as a kid, and we didn't go to a hospital. And my parents would, you know, soothe me themselves, but you didn't show weakness in terms of crying. And so it changed when I was an adult, and I became much more aware of the world, going to university, partners, romantic partners. So yeah, it's definitely come in two phases for me, and it's been a journey of learning, and I'm nowhere near through that journey. Still got so much to learn, but I think one of the best things that happened to me was engaging with the idea of being a feminist. And I think every man should be a feminist, and I think there's huge misunderstandings of what that means, but that was definitely a big thing for me.
Thanks, Michael. Danny, I want to ask you the same question, because what I'm trying to do here is kind of just like set a foundation for your personal experiences and how you view this topic. So the question is, again, what does masculinity mean to you, and how has it been shaped by your race or your understanding of, say, toxic and hypermasculinity?
I think for me, when I think about masculinity, I have to look at it as it is defined contextually. You know, so masculinity is, you know, the social expectations of being a man. We often refer to kind of the roles and behaviors and the attributes that are considered to be appropriate for boys and men in any given society. I think for me, I have experienced masculinity in a way that I would likely not want most people to experience, especially when we look to hypermasculinity, when we look to toxic masculinity. For me, I think toxic masculinity has been a huge aspect of my life, in the sense of it is this performance that is invented to reinforce, you know, masculinity, which is, you know, both real, natural, and biological. What I thought masculinity was growing up in a, you know, Caribbean household, highly religious household, was, you know, you had to be extremely athletic, you had to be emotionless, you had to be aggressive. It was very much formed by things that I saw on TV, I grew up in a neighborhood where there was a lot of gangs, so there was a lot around, being this hyper masculine man that, didn't have much respect for women or didn't have much respect for, just social norms and, normal standards of behavior. There was a lot of promiscuity around masculinity for me. And I think what happens is, as I grew up and as I became more in tune with my own self and the negative ways and the positive ways that masculinity was affecting me, I kind of just like formed my own, definition of masculinity. So for me, what it means to me now is, breaking out of the strict molds that masculinity has formed for me when it comes to my ability to express feelings, emotions, love, and happiness, not allowing that to be stifled, respecting my more feminine sides and mannerisms that I do have, restricting boundaries of self-expression, so removing all of that, communicating my feelings, asking for help when needed, understanding kind of just like the negative impact that masculinity had on me, and then therefore working through that has been a big thing for me. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing, Danny. Okay, Michael, I'm coming back to you. You mentioned kind of briefly about how your perception of masculinity has changed over time. So I guess I want to just drill in a bit into that and asking about the social constructs that you've come to exist in, and that how that affects how you view yourself in the world today.
I still think that Black men, because this is obviously inextricably linked to race, are allowed to be hyper masculine, and I think it's for certain communities it's acceptable and it's a refuge. You're allowed to be hyper masculine, but you're not allowed to be, or it's not considered normal to be hyper intelligent, for example, hyper creative, having the kind of mind that creates products that the world needs or uses. So for me, the hypermasculinity, it enforces stereotypes, and the one for Black people and Black men especially they aren't ones that I look at fondly. And I think I've spent many years reacting against that. And sometimes you overcompensate. And so therefore because you want to defy those stereotypes, perhaps you try to fit into a box that's been created for you in a very white-centric society. I grew up in London, but I grew up in a particularly middle-class, middle-upper kind of environment. Everyone was at private school, which only 7% of the population in the UK have access to because of income. And therefore, there are certain people who are arbiters of taste and what's right, and they also open the doors to power. So you feel like you have to fit into their box of you, and your masculinity or hyper masculinity is kind of acceptable. But if you were particularly well spoken, well read, you would often have people say to you, and they thought it was a compliment, oh, you're particularly articulate, you're particularly well read, and there would be that kind of parenthesis ... for one of them, for a Black person, and that was common. And I still think that happens today, but people are probably a bit smarter in the way they say it. I've definitely experienced that here in Norway. So societally, unfortunately, I don't think a lot has changed since I was a teenager, a kid, but I do find that I'm trying to change the experiences for my children. So my parents never took us to exhibitions or shows, the opera. I make a point of taking my children to many of these things because I think it's important for them to have a full spectrum of experiences, not just ones that quote unquote Black people are considered okay to experience and be at, usually sport and music. And my children at very young ages, 10 and 12, have experienced people staring at them in the opera. They're very well dressed. My son wears loafers, that kind of thing. It's on a very basic level. So I'm not sure how far we've come. And I think that it's imperative that all of us, we have to think about perceptions and how people are perceived, and try to open our minds to what we think we know about people and how we've been conditioned, and actually realize that it's not real.
Thanks, Michael. Daniel, I'm going to come to you. I guess we can say that you have multiple and compounding identities that, has been framed, say by how you experience the world. In this regard, you openly identify as a Black, gay, Haitian American man who was raised in a very religious home. So how have you navigated societal expectations over time?
I think for me, navigating societal expectation of me was extremely rooted in navigating my family's expectation of me, both on a cultural level, but also on a religious level. My mother's a pastor. We grew up in an extremely religious household where, I remember being a young child at the age of 9, 10, 11, and, having my mother on the podium and speaking openly against homosexuality and how individuals who identified as such would go to hell. And for me, that was at a point traumatic. So therefore, it reinforced this extremely negative pressure on me to, have this, masculine appearance and try to rid myself of a lot of my authentic, behaviors and mannerism, and trying to hide that. So as I grew up, I realized that in order for me to really navigate through the world in a way that was healthy, I had to kind of relinquish the expectations that my family, my religion, and my culture had on me when it comes to being a masculine man, or when it came to being a man, period. So my true moment of kind of just freedom didn't come until I was in my mid-20s. And I came out to my mother and told her I was gay, and actually experienced everything that I actually feared, right? So growing up, my entire life was based on this fear of my parents finding out I was gay, or, friends and family finding out I was gay. And so therefore, there was always this pressure to conform to the standard ideology of what masculinity is. So when I finally kind of like ripped that bandage off and told my mother that I was gay, and knew the aftermath of that, and I prepared myself for that, and having those 4 years of being disowned by my family, my mother especially, a lot of people ask me like, oh my God, that must have been extremely traumatic. And I was just like, actually, it was extremely relieving, actually, right? Because I knew it was going to happen. I expected it to happen. And I spent all of my life kind of just like pushing it off. So when I was able to release that, I was able to actually authentically experience the world, right, as my true self. I never had to fear whether or not my parents were going to find out, because now they knew, right? And I was already living the consequences of that action, which was I was not able to talk to them. I was not coming home for Christmas. I was not, getting any calls and so on and so forth. I was disowned by my family, but now I was able to live my true self. So once that occurred, I think what basically happened was I had an extremely authentic experience in the world. And it wasn't always good. It definitely was not always good, but I think it was more closely related to allowing me being my true self. And I'm still very much navigating through that.
All right. Thanks, Danny. Thank you for sharing. I know we're going into quite personal stuff, but I think they're quite relevant in terms of then relating it back to the workplace and how we experience the world within that context. Michael, I'm going to come back to you. In the last, when you were speaking last, you talked about, you know, your experience as a Black man and the interaction with whiteness. And as somebody who's grown up basically your entire life in the West, in this case, the UK, and now currently you live in Norway, do you consider whether you have partaken in the conscious or unconscious shrinking of self to fit in to survive? Because you talked earlier about, you know, having to fit a mold and the expectation of what it was to be Black. So how do you consciously do that or unconsciously do that now or not?
Yeah, good question. I consciously and unconsciously shrink myself. I think in the last couple of years, actually, much less so. I no longer shrink myself. And I think part of that, at least here in Norway, has been because I've found my tribe. I've found people with whom I feel very comfortable with, and I feel I can be my authentic self, and they can promote, but also criticize and say, hey, you know, you could tone that down or you could do this better. And when you have that honesty around you, then you feel safe. And I think that's kind of one of the definitions of a safe space. But and I would much less so in the UK did I shrink myself, because I felt much more comfortable and confident in what I could do and what I knew. But and I don't think my white friends and counterparts have to do this at all. But there have been situations where I've been in interviews, I've been in meetings where I have consciously made a decision not to show too much intelligence, not to basically solve a problem or an idea or come up with too many ideas, because you don't want to hog the limelight, you don't want to overshadow people. And I think a lot of women go through this in very masculine, male-dominated fields, because the minute you do that, you know that for every 2 or 3 people who are admiring you and say, okay, that's cool, there's going to be 1 or 2 who really don't, and then they could become a problem. And if you put your head above the parapet, you could create problems for yourself, which, you know, goes directly against the ideas that we were told as children about, you know, you've got to be the absolute best you can be in order to get the jobs you deserve and really fly professionally. So I've had to I've consciously shrunk myself mentally, intelligence-wise, but also physically. When I've walked into rooms on a very basic level, on the street, so as not to make people afraid, especially women, but especially white women, especially in areas where there were less Black people. And here in Norway, I live in a very suburban area on the west side of town, lots of older people. And just to make people feel comfortable, in my mind, I would try to, I walk quickly, heavy stride, but I try to soften even the way I step so as not to scare people. And this is in broad daylight. And you extrapolate that onto like much wider societal, more important arenas. And absolutely, I wouldn't stand, you know, as tall with chest out, because you can make certain people, usually white males, feel very self-conscious. And that would be someone who's probably insecure in themselves. And that's not all people. It's not all white males. It's not all men. But it would be, there've been enough people who've decision makers who can really affect your life, your day, that you take on board, and you get to read people pretty quickly, and you take on board, actually, okay, this might be one where let's tone down just how smart you are, or how much. And often that smartness is actually really just your level of interest. You're so engaged and you so want to put your best foot forward, but it's not always taken well. And that lesson, I learned that as a teenager, and it's very crushing as a young person, especially in a marginalized community where you want to aspire to the people you see in newspapers and the places they work. And then you realize that actually putting your best self forward can be disadvantageous. I do it much less so now. I'm in a phase of my life now where I think the world's changed. I don't think the unwritten rules that existed, I don't think they exist anymore. I think Brexit and I think Trump especially, I kind of look at the world and I think, oh, so actually you can say really heinous things about disabled people and women, and actually it's okay because no one cares. So I think the rules of civilized behavior, of all these social mores, so many of them are broken now. Social media has also helped that actually I just live myself, my authentic self, and that self is actually one that's, you know, respectful of people and humble. But yeah, I go into rooms and I want people to know this is what I think and this is what I aspire to do, and are you with me? And if you're not, we move on.
Thanks, Michael. So I guess both of you have touched on race and masculinity and Blackness. So I just really want to ask quick questions here. First to Danny. So I know you also personally, and I know you value yourself in all kinds of ways, and also as a Black man. My question for you is, do you think society values you as a man and as a Black man?
I think that's a heavy question. You know, it's one of those questions that depends on several things. For me, I think that depends on where I am, who I'm around, and also like what people register when they meet me, right? So are you registering that I'm a Black man? Are you registering that I'm a gay man? Are you registering both simultaneously, right? So my value is associated to your understanding of Blackness, your understanding of homosexuality, and not so much so your understanding of Danny, right? So what I've come to realize is that, for example, if we look at, you know, how Black men are treated in the US, where Black men are often criminalized, they're also often seen as thugs, they're often, you know, being brutalized by, you know, police, so on and so forth, you would say that no, you know, the society does not value Black men, right? But then when you are looking in a situation here like Norway, where, you know, these things are not happening as often, some people might have this perception like, oh, society here truly values Black men here in Norway, right? And for me, you know, I can say that, yes, you know, I do at times as a Black man often feel as if like I am not being valued by society, but I think my experience has been more rooted in me not feeling valued by society because of my homosexuality. I have, you know, I have had the privilege, and I say this for not being kind of for not experiencing some of like the more racist actions towards Black men. You know, so I'm not often stopped by the police. I've never been arrested. I've never been brutalized. I've never faced some of these extreme behaviors because I am a Black man, right? But I have experienced them because I am a gay man, right? So even here in Norway, you know, and that's the funny thing, because of the fact that, you know, we live here in Norway where people think like, oh, Norway is extremely accepting, so on and so forth. And, you know, so, you know, people shouldn't feel as if like they're being discriminated against. And for me as a Black man, I have not felt like kind of like that overt discrimination here in Norway because I'm a Black man, but I have felt it because I am a gay man, right? So my partner and I, so I'm a Black man, he is a Middle Eastern man. We have gotten, you know, beers thrown at us, you know, on the streets of Norway. We've gotten spat on, you know, on buses here in Norway. We've gotten yelled at, you know, we've gotten, you know, all of these kind of like experiences that makes you feel as if you are not a valued citizen of this country. So like I said in the beginning, you know, my value, how society values me, or how I perceive how society values me, is very dependent on where I am, who I'm around, and how I am being registered, and which parts of me is being registered.
Right. Thanks a lot, Danny, for sharing. Okay, there's a lot to unpack, like when you both speak and share, because it's such a heavy topic, and you're doing it as honestly as, you know, I can even imagine. But I just really want to say thank you for sharing. In preparing for this conversation, you know, I spoken with Michael and also Danny, and both of them I know, you know, personally, and, you know, trying to nuance the experience of Blackness in the West and how it differs for each and every one of us. You know, I am a Black woman, and I am Nigerian, I am American, and also recently Norwegian, and Michael, you know, is British, Ghanaian. And then we have Danny, who's Haitian American. And we've all had completely different experiences. Like, we have similarities in our experiences of Blackness, but also quite different. And I remember kind of recently, I was at I was actually at a workplace, a very fancy location, and Michael was there. And something had happened, and Michael had gotten upset. And I have Michael's permission to share this, by the way. Michael had gotten upset, and understandably so, because it was a very upsetting situation. And, you know, Michael had kind of just like expressed his annoyance with the situation. And I just had this fright. You know, my thought was, of course, I know that Michael was right to be upset, but I kept thinking, oh, you can't do that. Or like, the only two Black people in this space. You know, you can't get that mad. You have to calm down. You have to settle down. And also reflecting on when I've been in typical white posh spaces, say with my partner who's white, and he's gotten mad, and I'm not thinking, oh, you can't get mad. I'm just like, yeah, you tell him, right? And then just realizing for myself the difference in which, like the different ways in which I have expectations for, say, men or people on the basis of their race based on social conditioning, you know, and also thinking about how that intersects with my experience of being like the angry Black woman, where you say something because you're in the right to say so, but the world perceives you as angry. And then also reflecting that had that exact experience happened with my partner, I would not even have thought for a second, oh, sorry, you can't get upset because you're a Black man. And when you get upset, every other Black man that walks into the space will be judged on the account of how you're experienced. And I think this is something that Black people often have to contend with in the world. And I think this brings me to my next question. So now I want to frame the next couple of questions around the workplace. And Danny, you work in human resource, right? And so I want to talk about workplace gaslighting, tone policing, what is considered to be professional, for example, and the relentless rhetoric of angry Black person, or, you know, more famously, angry Black woman. So I do want to ask you, is there an angry Black man in the workplace perception, or is that perceived differently? And second, how do men fit in within the hyper masculine and homogeneous workplace?
Okay. So yeah, I think there is this idea of the angry Black man rhetoric in the workplace, and it's very much so rooted in the same type of, you know, behaviors or assumptions that you just talked about, where this idea of that we don't simply represent ourselves in the workplace, right? We represent every Black person that will come after us, right? So oftentimes within the workplace, we are, you know, the only Black person or one of very few. So therefore, it is like this, it is this added pressure, it is this added weight, it is this conscious knowledge that you are not here solely to yield your own, you know, experience, but also to make room for the next, right? So therefore, you stifle yourself a lot of times in order to allow that door to stay open for the next Black person, right? For me, I have found that if I find myself fortunate enough, right? And that's sad to say at times, fortunate enough to put myself or find myself in predominantly white spaces, I have to allow myself to take on a lot more than I would in other spaces where there is a lot more diversity, right? So if somebody says something that they believe is a joke and I find it to be extremely offensive, I can't have an authentic reaction to that, right? What I have to do is I have to swallow it, put on a nice face, basically what we call coding, and say, you put on that fine. And, people in the room, and and the crazy part is there are other individuals in the room who understand that this is not okay, who understand that you should not be dealing with this. You should not have experienced this. You should not have had this said to you. But it is this idea that we all have to maintain a level of politeness, right? That we must conform to, the ideology that we must stay professional. And professional for a Black man is to be this reserved, somewhat docile individual, as opposed to if I said something to one of my white colleagues and they were upset about it, they can be angry. They can, show authentic reactions to, what has just occurred. I unfortunately, and many Black men don't have that luxury, right? But what I do realize is that Black men in general have an advantage over the Black woman in the workplace, where when the time comes where we do get angry, we are able to speak about our anger, even if we show the anger and it is not registered well, we have the opportunity to defend our anger, right? And we are able to defend our anger and say that this is why, we got angry. Whereas the angry Black woman rhetoric, she does not have that access, right? As soon as she has gotten angry, there has been so much that has been attributed to her personality, behavior, upbringing, skin tone, education, that we often sometimes have the luxury of not having to face. So it is difficult in the workplace to navigate around having your authentic reactions when it comes to, when you face levels of, discrimination, microaggression, implicit biases, so on and so forth. But when we do, it's not okay, but we are able to defend it. But I don't believe our counterparts have that same luxury, right? Black women are often highly kind of, seen as unruly, uneducated when they do decide to exhibit their feelings, or especially this ideology around if a Black woman is not always smiling, then she's angry, and that alone already creates a perception of her, and therefore anything that she does say after that might not be easily, agreed upon, is then saying, okay, she's an angry Black woman, right? Mm-hmm. And also this ideology that many people, and I've seen it within my workplace, that people have of, the intimidating Black woman. Oh my gosh, she's extremely intimidating. And it is being often said as if it is a compliment, but it sets the tone for what will come later, right? She starts off as, being labeled as intimidating. And then, everybody in the room like, oh yeah, this individual is intimidating. And then later on, if she assert her power, assert her energy, she is now angry if she does it in a way that makes other people around her feel uncomfortable. Right. So we do face the challenges of the angry Black woman, but angry Black man, but I think we often, as Black men, we need to understand that Black women are at a further disadvantage when it comes to that in the workplace.
Right. Thanks for sharing, Danny. And I see Michael wants to contribute to this as well. Before I do that, just wanting to say thank you for the comments and the questions. Keep them coming. We'll get to them. And just quickly want to say something based on what Danny had said in terms of how you might not say speak up or address something that is overtly racist, or do it in a way that is a little bit more subdued than you would normally do. I find that quite interesting because I do the opposite. And I think that's also how I have this angry Black woman badge, which I wear proudly, by the way. Just wanting to say as well, there was a comment here about internalized racism. I think we need to separate the two. There's a difference between internalized racism and also feeling like you have the responsibility of carrying your entire race and everyone who comes after. So you're not really allowed to mess up. And that's kind of like what I was trying to nuance when I was talking about Michael, knowing fully well that he's allowed to be angry, but then just feeling like, you know, we're the only two people in this very white space, and just thinking about everybody else who comes after us and how they're perceived. And it's really complex, and there's no like clear black or white line, you know, separating them, but it's quite interesting to unpack. Michael, please.
I don't, thank you. I don't have a lot more to add, but I was just listening to Danny. I just had to, and it always hits me, I just had to point out, especially to the non-Black people who are watching and listening, to ask themselves when during the Obama years, when did they ever see him lose his cool or appear annoyed? Because to Black people, it was practiced. It was heavily practiced. You had to maintain control. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is you can assume the most powerful office in the world, as they often call it, and yet you still can't be your authentic self. I listened to Pod Save America, and these guys worked with him for 8 years, and he would swear and he would be pissed, and some of his opponents, I mean, he had awful things to say, like anyone would, but he could never express. He had to be unflappable. And as Danny said, you know, when you're a Black man in a very professional space, you're almost unflappable. Nothing gets to you. And you have to be almost not human. And then you contrast that with what his wife, who wasn't in office, she wasn't seeking office, unlike Hillary during Bill's years, she wasn't trying to create policy. What Michelle went through, despite carrying herself so well, you know, she came up with the catchphrase, when they go low, we go high. We had to show we're so much better. We couldn't be riled, and people would attack her physically, they'd attack her intelligence, despite the fact that, you know, she had multiple degrees, and she gave up a very promising career to support him. You know, all the things that, you know, Nancy Reagan was praised for. You see it again with someone like Serena Williams, which I think is why Black people love her so much, because when she won so much and she was visibly angry, and you'd be angry when you lose, you know, she would be criticized. I think she got chucked out of the US Open once for just being mad. Yeah, white guys could smash rackets, they could hit ball boys by accident, and you can get away with it. So I guess it means that we're still treading this path. And when a man assumes the most powerful office in the world and still has to do that, it means that for the rest of us, not much has changed. And that's actually it's a standard very few of us can maintain and can reach. So in the experience that Chisom recalls, we won't go into detail, but I think at that moment, and Chisom and I will probably always agree to disagree on that, I felt like I knew exactly what I was doing. And by that point, I just thought, no, you know, no muss, no more. This is not going to happen. And I could see it was the wrong thing to do, but I think I would still do the same thing 9 times out of 10, especially as after, say, Obama, we had a man who just broke every norm. And if a Black man had done 1/10 of what Donald Trump had done, I mean, they would have stormed the Capitol long before they did. So it's not whataboutery. It really is the way the world is. And I'd love people to, you know, just think about that. Just think about Obama and what they thought about him and what they saw from all those years and then what followed.
Thanks, Michael. I think it's interesting. I guess, you know, when I talk about this with people of color in general, and I think also especially Black people, is sometimes the experience of Blackness is difficult to articulate. And I think every group have different experiences and that's unique to them. But I think the experience of navigating white spaces is quite difficult, and seeing how that difference occurs for me, how I feel, say, when I'm in any country on the African continent versus where I'm in the West. Like, there's a whole different Chisom that shows up. And it's something that is almost like an innate programming that I don't have control over, because I feel like, oh, here I don't have to be anybody else. I can just exist. I don't have to carry all the Nigerians that come after me or all the Kenyans that come after me, and I think it's an interesting social conditioning that we learn over time. My parents never taught me this is how you be or how you should be in the world, and I think it's just something that is learned over time through experience. Michael, I have a question for you actually, which is based on kind of what we're talking about now and within the workplace. And I think you and Danny nuanced it in terms of you have to be unflappable. So basically, and it's an interesting phrase that I think a lot of Black people across the world, and especially when they exist in the West, have heard twice as hard, right? It's twice as hard to get half as much. So many Black people in the West, especially in the US, and I also think to some degree in the US, have heard this phrase at one point or the other. And it manifests in educational settings, in society, and in the workplace. It basically means that you have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition as a white man or as somebody who's not Black. So I think it also hints at the burden most Black people carry in the West, where to some degree one might feel that they serve as a representation of the entire race that we've spoken about. So what is your experience and understanding of this phrase, and how has that changed over time?
Yeah, I've heard the phrase, and I had a light bulb moment a few years ago. In the UK, I'd heard the phrase, you have to work twice as hard, and you have to be that much better. And I got it from my parents, and lo and behold, many other Black young kids also got that from their parents. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I heard the rest of that adage, and it was from America. It was, work twice as hard for half as much. And I found it soul destroying. I was absolutely distraught. And I actually don't use the phrase with my children, because I think if you say that to a 7-year-old, for example, Amy, what are you telling them about life? Like where's the hope there? If you tell them, you can tell them you have to work twice as hard, you have to really smash it, but for half as much, there's an element of, we say that in the world we live in now, technology means that anyone can create anything and become great. So in theory, you don't actually, you will get your just desserts, but you only have to look at, who can raise money from a venture capitalist, for example, to know that's just not the truth. Again, maybe I'm just too cynical. I don't think a great deal has changed. And if I pivot to the country we all live in right now, there's also on the panel in Norway, I don't see the beginnings of much growth at all. I do not see many Black people, or I don't actually know of any notable Black people of note in power positions, in politics, in business, in media. And I look around me. This is something I'm used to doing in the UK. I could name more influential thought leaders and movers and shakers in an American context than I could here. And that to me is deeply worrying. And it says that there's something wrong at the heart of society in terms of opportunities to have access. I mean, bearing in mind, this is not a society, for example, in education, that's particularly expensive. Yet global companies here, the few that are here, I very rarely see people of color. One of the big 4 accountancy firms, for example, I won't say which one, but they have a day where they welcome their new graduates. And it's they made a big thing about it on LinkedIn. So I watched the video. I think it was 225 new graduates came in for that year. And I looked very carefully at one thing. Did I see anyone who looks like me? And a lot of Black people also know this phrase, you can't be what you can't see. And therefore, if I don't see someone who looks like me, a Black man, I start to get very, very itchy and uncomfortable for Black people, not for myself. So I really think that we need to stop saying that to our children, but we also need to see people like us creating things. I mean, Chisom has this place here, which is on slap bang in the middle of Oslo, and it's so symbolic. And I used to underrate the importance of symbolism, but actually it's really important. And now, and then there's a next stage, and there's a next stage, and there's a next stage, and we do need to keep building. But we need to create access to these corridors of power. And here in Norway, at least, I don't see them. But I would love someone to disabuse me of that notion.
Thanks, Michael. Danny, do you have any experience with the phrase?
Yeah, I think, when you said it earlier, twice as hard for half as much, I was like, oh, okay, that was actually better than what I was hearing growing up was twice as hard for half as much. So it's this idea that no matter how hard you work, you will never equate to the full value of a white person. And, people, I think a lot of our parents, especially Caribbean parents in the US, say this as a way to motivate their child, motivate their children to do better in school and so on and so forth, without understanding, the impact, the negative impact that it has on you, right? And I don't think I really started seeing the negative impact until I was in college, where oftentimes, especially when you would be in group settings where, or you had a group assignment to do, where I would see, or I would find myself over, exerting myself and doing so much work where my counterparts, which was often, a 2 or 3 other, white individuals, were so relaxed. Right. And the burden that I put on myself to overperform simply just to be seen as, half as good as they were. So it's one of those things that, it follows you throughout life, and it continues having this negative impact on you. I find myself even now, talking to friends who, have, colleagues who would work, 9 to 5. And they're stuck at the office from 9 to 7, 9 to 8, simply trying to prove themselves so that they don't get overlooked for a promotion, or they can simply be considered for a promotion, right? I have a friend of mine who tells me often that she does not feel comfortable leaving the office at 5 o'clock, right? Because although all of her other counterparts do it, she feels as if as soon as she does it, she will then, be labeled as lazy or not putting in enough work. And not only does that happen, but, she told me the first time that, she even did it, it was referenced later on in the week. Oh, we saw you left early on Thursday. Wait, I didn't leave early on Thursday. I left at 5 o'clock, and work finishes at 5 o'clock. So, a lot of people have this idea that, okay, this is we're internalizing these behaviors, or we're internalizing these biases. But in the absence of them, if we don't do them, we quickly are reminded that you should fall in line. So.
Thanks for sharing, Danny. I'm trying to think about my experience with the world. I think for those who are Nigerians or have Nigerian parents, you might quickly understand that in Nigeria, our parents think we're God's gift to the world, for better and for worse, because there's a lot of expectation that comes with being the best and, coming first in class, regardless of who's there. And so I never really heard that word growing up. My mom just expected me and my siblings to be the best. And that is how I approached the world, and which meant that I put a lot of pressure on myself, of course, to do well, not necessarily to do better than, it's irrelevant who was in class, if they were white, pink, purple. I just had to be the best, because that's what Nigerians do. At least that's what they do in England. That's what they do in the US. And when you understand that your parents are paying thousands of dollars, that could feed an entire village, for a while to send you to school, that is how you repay them. So growing up, I never really had this. And I think to some benefit now, because I still approach the world with that perspective. I'm going to do the best that I can. The only competition I have is the person staring back at me in the mirror. But I nonetheless recognize through social conditioning in the West, where I feel anyways, that as a Black woman, I literally have to go to the moon and find out some new technology, do something grand to even be recognized 10%, you know, at 10% the same way, say, other people, you know, get recognized. And I find it quite interesting because, of course, tongue in cheek, but sometimes I kind of make the joke where some people just kind of have to wake up and be like, yo, I woke up. And you're like, hey, wonderful, you woke up. And then Black women have to do so much more to get the recognition. And that recognition needs to fit into what is considered professional. You know, it needs to fit into, how do you wear your hair? How do you speak? You know, how do you address things? How do you take the back seats? And there's a lot that is compounded by that. So I find myself constantly fighting who I innately am from how I was conditioned as a Nigerian growing up in the US versus what society expects of me, and then having to navigate perceptions. I mean, in Norway, I'm told so often how different I am, and it's a compliment, you know, when it's handed to me. But I'm thinking, this is not a compliment, because you're essentially telling me that other people who look like me are not as good. And I think one of you had said earlier about being, you know, I think it was Danny who talked about Black women often being seen as intimidating. And I had to reframe what that meant for me, because someone literally told me last week that I was intimidating, and they meant it as a compliment. And I had to reframe what that meant, because oftentimes Black women, you hear you're intimidating, you're aggressive. And then just having to reframe, I am not intimidating, you are intimidated, because you have a different perception of what I should be and how I should present as a woman, especially as a Black woman. Okay. Before I move to the next topic, I see a comment here. I agree that you don't see many colored people. I just want to point out that we don't say colored people, we say people of color. Just in general, that caught my eye. So I think it's important to just mention that language and the type of words we use matter. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question that I have here, and also just bringing it back to the workplace. Danny, I want to ask you about workplace representation. You know, what does representation and power for Black men look like in the Nordics and in Norway and perhaps the world? And I know Michael had nuanced this a bit, and I just want to hear from your perspective, since you work actively in recruitment and human resources.
I think, you know, that actually comes in twofold, because what I see when it comes to representation in the workplace, when it comes to Black men, is two things. You know, there is this absence of Black men holding high positions here in Norway. We can all attest to that. But there is also an aspect of it where Black men are not applying for these positions because they feel as if they will not be offered the same equal, you know, opportunities to, you know, even interview for these positions. So I look at certain positions that, you know, are being applied, you know, people are applying for, and I'll, you know, go through the CVs and so on and so forth, and I will see no Black individual applying for these positions. And then I start thinking about two things. You know, is it simply because of the fact that we're taking ourselves out of the race? Or is it that the organizations or the companies that, you know, are having these positions open have not created a space, you know, where individuals feel that, you know, a space that is inclusive or diverse enough where individuals, you know, feel excited to apply for these positions? You know, I think about my past experiences as a Black man, but also as a gay man, where, you know, my masculinity and my sexual orientation had a huge impact on, you know, the certain companies that I would apply for, certain jobs that I would apply for, simply because prior to applying for these positions, I would, you know, research the company. I would look at the individuals who work in those spaces, and I would not be able to see individuals who look like me. So there was this fear of going into that space and being the one and having to, you know, start this process by myself and navigating through all of this by myself. So I basically kind of like shot myself in the foot and said, you know, I'm not going to enter these spaces, right? So I was looking for spaces that were a lot more welcoming. So So when I think about, representation in the workplace here in Norway, I think about these things. I think about whether or not, one, companies are not creating spaces where Black people feel as though, if they enter them, they will be received and feel as if a sense of belonging. Or is it that, we have, kind of like pulled ourselves out of the race and say that, there are certain positions that we simply will not apply for, or certain spaces that we just don't want to be in. And earlier this week, I spoke to a friend of mine where I told them that I was going to be doing this panel discussion. And one of the first things that she said, she was born and raised here in Norway. And one of the first things that she said was, but there are Black people in power positions. She was just like, for example, Chisom, she is a 3-time founder and she has her own companies and so on and so forth. And I'm just like, but that in itself should tell you something, right? And she, referenced a couple of other individuals within my network. And one of the first things that I told her, I was just like, and one thing that you realize is that oftentimes, 9 out of 10 of those individuals, she pointed out, had to create their own spaces, right? They had to be founders of companies because they had to create spaces where they felt comfortable. They weren't simply entering spaces or holding positions of like high companies such as, PwC, Ernst & Young, and so on and so forth. They were finding their own space. They were creating their own, companies and so on and so forth. And there's a difference, right? So we cannot simply say that, because of the fact that, individuals are going out of their ways to create their own space, therefore we do not have a problem when it comes to representation of the workplace, because I shouldn't have to create my own space in order for me to feel comfortable. I should be able to enter spaces where others feel comfortable in and still feel comfortable myself. So representation, is something that's extremely heavy, especially when we look at, here in Norway. But we have to look at it on both ends. It's like, okay, how do we push, Black people to continuously try to enter these spaces, while at the same time making sure that companies create a space where they feel comfortable.
Thanks, Danny. And I have to agree with that because I had a similar conversation recently where a friend of mine who I was speaking to, said, she had to admit that in the Nordics as a whole, there are actually quite a lot of people of color in general, so Black, brown, and everything else in between that identify within that, umbrella. You actually see them quite visible as leaders. And yeah, I had to say exactly the same thing, Danny, is oftentimes like 9 times out of 10, we've created our own spaces, we've created our own businesses, and then in that sense become leaders. Whereas you don't find, say, global head of this or global head of that position at any company at most companies, rather, giving to people of color. And this is inherently problematic as well. On the topic of workplace and job accessibility, Michael, I do want to ask you, from your point of view, what type of jobs, because you've been in Norway for 5 years now or so, and I know in that time you have had difficulty navigating the job space, so to say. So in your experience, what type of jobs are available to, say, people of color or even Black people, on the basis of their identities, and how does this impact their ability to sustain a healthy work-life balance outside of work?
I think that in Norway, it's from anecdotally, and I've been around enough years to have a good overview, but anecdotally, people are pigeonholed into certain things. So for a while, I was a DHL courier driver, and I very quickly saw that there were a majority of those drivers were people of color, not many sort of white Norwegians. If any. And then I would look around other companies, whether it's Posten or yet others, UPS, etc. And it seemed there was a preponderance of Black men. So that was something that deemed we could do. You pick up, you deliver, doesn't require a great deal of intelligence, use of your time. You're a body, and the hours of jobs like this are pretty much never ending. You finish when you finish, and you don't get paid if you don't deliver. And those kind of jobs seem to be given to people on the margins of society, and it counts, I guess, as a respectable job. Contrast that with I think at least 80% of companies in Norway are SMEs, would have between 8 and 12 people. And then you'd have your larger companies, and another game I play, and I'm not sure whether many white people need to play this game, but I will go into a company and I'll look at the team or who we are, and I'll have a good look at who we are. So, especially in law or communications and PR where I've worked, I would look at the team, and I would look to see if there's anyone like me or anyone looks like Chisom. And at least here in Norway, when I say it's never the case, it very rarely is the case. And that is inherently problematic, to borrow Chisom's phrase. It's problematic for our children, it's problematic for society, it's also problematic just for optimum results. It's problematic for the bottom line, because the diversity of workforce leads to a diversity of thought. And it's not just about the makeup, the physical makeup, it's the way people think, because it's shaped by their experiences and what they've seen, which can deliver better experiences. So therefore, I've found that here in Norway, there are taxi drivers are often Southeast Asian in origin, their heritage, or East African. And then you've got couriers. If you look around you and you look at Foodora couriers, the food couriers, for example, often tend to be, again, people of color. These are things which I guess you're dispensable. That's how I look at it. The jobs which really move society, where decisions are made, levers of power. And to answer a question I saw in a chat from Christopher, which I really appreciate, Adade Raja or some of these other people you mentioned, I see they're people of color, but I don't have a great, they're not a reference point for me, in the same way that Denzel Washington is more of a reference point for me than Brad Pitt. I appreciate where they are, but they are not someone I would then turn to my children and say, oh, look what someone who looked like your father did. And it's nuanced, and it doesn't mean that it's not valid, but that symbolism is really important. So again, if people can start pointing me to Black men and Black women, people who look like me and Chisom, i.e., and let's be blunt, have 2 Black parents, for example, or a Black parent and maybe someone else from another race, or even biracial. Here in Norway, I can say the US and UK, I could give you examples, but here in Norway, in the year of our Lord 2022, if you could point me to them, I will go and look at them. But right now, this is seriously problematic.
Thanks, Michael. I like how you're funny while having like this.
Here in the year alone.
So it's important we laugh through this. Thank you.
If you don't laugh, you cry.
I think actually now that we're on the topic of, Michael just talked about Adade Raja not being a reference point to him, as to say Denzel. I think maybe it's also important to nuance people of color, because there's a difference between, like, at least within the group. I mean, people of color is used to encompass a majority of the world, which is also a bit ridiculous sometimes, but I guess this is where we're at, and we've not found language to do it better. But there is a difference with, say, people who are brown from people who are white. And then when we start factoring in colorism and proximity to whiteness, like, it's a lot to unpack. So Danny, I actually want to ask you about this. And also being mindful that we have 15 minutes left. So we have to keep it short and keep our answers quite short and sweet. So Danny, proximity to whiteness, unconscious anti-Blackness, and colorism. That's what I want to talk about right now. Is the Black experience similar to the experiences of other people of color? And how does centering, say, brown and Asian experiences in certain contexts minimize Black experiences?
Okay. In
I
short
know,
responses,
massive question, but do your best in a short time.
In short responses, I think, when it comes to proximity to whiteness, there is access that will be afforded to you that will not be offered to somebody like myself, who is on the darker side, but also Michael, who is on the darker side. So when we look at, other individuals that fall under the umbrella of color, like a colored person, or like we just said, people of color, and not saying colored person, but people of color, we tend to look at, Asians and also, Southeast Asians, and so on and so forth. But what I've realized is the experience of a lot of these individuals somewhat does undermine the Black experience, simply because you will have these individuals say like, oh, but I've been given these opportunities. I've had access to this. I've been able to do this. So why can't you? And I think what we don't realize is, even when we talk about Black individuals, the access that, let's say, a light-skinned individual, right? A light-skinned Black person, the access that they will have is completely different than the access and the opportunities that a darker skinned Black person will have. So we look at media, we look at, fashion, we look at, all of these, spaces where there's representation of Black people. And what you often see is, light-skinned individuals with long hair, curly hair, but also when I look at, Black people in general, we often are put in a position where we have to attend to, Western ideologies of beauty, right? So oftentimes you will not see a professional male with dreadlocks, because oftentimes that is deemed as, unkept, unruly. You will not see oftentimes, a Black woman with her hair out in the afro, because that is seen as untamed and unruly. What you will see is us, moving towards these ideologies around, white standards. And I'm excited to see that is changing. And I have to say that. But I think when it comes to, undermining Black experience, it's sometimes used as a survival, right? And that's what I've seen with a lot of the experiences that I've had with let's say, for example, Asian men. I've worked with a lot in my work back in the US. And what I've realized is that they will try to find this place of belonging and feeling as part of, by then discrediting my experience. And I think oftentimes we as Black people experience this more often than we should.
Thanks, Danny. Michael, how do you physically show up in the world? And I actually want Michael and Danny to talk about this very quickly. Of course, how do you physically show up? How do you physically present? How do you, what do you think might happen if you showed up at work or in a professional space in a hoodie or sweats? Which is completely common in Norway, by the way. Maybe not the hoodies or sweats, but in Norway, we tend to generally dress down in comparison to how we would dress to a work function, say in the US. Or,
that's true. So I present what I would consider pretty smart. It's always very deliberate. And you're right, here in the Nordics, it's very casual. I would attend parties, invited gatherings where I'd wear a suit, matching suit and blazer, and I would see other guys not doing the same, wouldn't wear a tie, and I was shocked. And also I welcomed it. But I find that in a professional sense, I didn't feel comfortable dressing down, because it's almost like you overcompensate just to make sure. So anywhere where you can tip odds in your favor, just so there any lingering doubts dispelled there, I can easily fix that by wearing a blazer and a shirt, wearing a tie and a jumper, and people, and if someone says, oh, slightly overdressed, it's much better than being slightly underdressed. And the thing about the hoodies and the sweats, I mean, that's it's really interesting for, at least for Black men, because that's associated with kind of the streets, quote unquote, you know, the thug life. It's very much the ghetto because you don't want to be seen hood up. Yeah, you know, you can be a white guy, graduated from Stanford, or didn't graduate, because that's the cool thing, wear a sweater, turn up to, you know, massive tech conference with a hoodie and and trainers, and you're really cool. Look at you. You're an iconoclast, and wow. Again, just don't get that luxury unless you play ball or you're a rapper. You don't get that luxury. So when I wear sweats, when I wear a hoodie or blazer, it's very much in my free time. I don't do that in a professional sense. I often come, even my shoes, they'll be buffed. I polish my shoes. I wear shoes. I don't wear trainers to most events. Again, not here in the Nordics, much more casual. And I make sure I smell good, always wear aftershave, and even my nails, I don't like having dirty nails, just because you're always thinking about the things that you can mitigate, so you don't come across in a way that we've been conditioned, unfortunately, even as Black people, to think makes us lesser. Like Danny said about the hair, the dreadlocks. My parents would never let me get my hair twisted or with locks, because there was a connotation of what that meant as a Black man. It was slightly rough. You were on the streets, and that makes people, white majority, fearful. So even still to this day in England, in UK, there are many cases where Black children are sent home from school because their hair is not in a certain way, in 2022, and it's shocking. So these ideas, if they're still happening today to young children, they haven't gone away. So we fight this every day. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Thanks, Michael. Danny.
I think for, Michael touched base on it, for me, especially in the US, the way that I present myself is highly focused on survival, right? It's highly focused on trying to mitigate the possibility that you will be stopped by police, trying to mitigate the possibility that you might be, like, for example, if somebody was if they were looking for an individual that was, running from the police, and you had on a hoodie, and that individual had on a hoodie, simply because of the fact that you had on a hoodie, you will be likely to be seen as, oh, you know what, you fit a certain description of said individual. So I think the way that I present in life, in everyday life, has been as a form of survival, especially in the US. I'm trying to always be at least more professional in the way that I dress. It goes back to the whole idea of the fact that, we have to work twice as hard to be half as good. So when I dress down, the way that is being interpreted versus how another individual dressing down is being interpreted is completely different, right? I remember my mother telling me, in life, like, if I didn't dress up for, like, I've always found myself overdressed for events, right? But the reason why she always pushed that was because of the fact that she never wanted people to have this perception that we didn't have enough, or, you couldn't afford, and so on and so forth. So I think, a lot of that is being conditioned from my experience from kids, from children. And for me, it has always been a place of trying to survive and never have to experience some of the harder Black experiences that other men of color have to face in the world, especially in the US. I am lucky to be here in Norway, where individuals are able to dress down a little bit more, but I haven't been able, my switch hasn't gone off on that yet.
Thanks for sharing. I think it's also worth mentioning here, because I know here we're just reflecting on both you and Michael's experiences, but I do want to share recently, Yoti, who is the co-founder of Umbrella, shared on LinkedIn that her brother, I think they're Indian, and that her brother had regularly been stopped by the police for no reason, asked, for his, ID to be identified in random places like the parking lot of the shopping center or Kiwi. So these things happen as well in Norway. And, she's not the only person who I've heard this from. I've heard this from, my Pakistani friends, my friends of color, and especially men. The only difference I see is that in the US, you might get shot and killed, whereas in Norway, the likelihood of that happening is very, very slim and probably doesn't happen. And another thing as well is I've also heard, I don't have a son, and I remember very clearly when I was pregnant, I have a daughter, being really terrified that she'd be a boy. And it was just for, oh my gosh, how's this child going to survive in the world being like a Black boy? Because of course, having that American conditioning where being Black and being stopped by the police, but also trying to figure out how that fits in within the Norwegian context. And I've had, Black mothers, brown mothers, Asian mothers, who've said to me that their kids, they've been called into Barnehagen, to kindergarten, for those who are not Norwegian, on the basis of their child had a little stain on their shirt, just to assess whether the child is being abused at home or not, that they've been called in on the basis of the food they bring in because it's not bread and cheese, so these things also happen here. And I think it's also important that we nuance that it happens here less violently, but certainly happens. Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to very quickly, because it happened this week, just share a quick story about what's happening in Norway. And this happens all the time. I live on the west side of town. My son was at school, and a teacher wrote to us this week to say that he had used incredibly offensive, explicit language to the first years. The first year had pointed him out, and this she's a first year teacher, never come across her. My son's in the last year of school, so we don't know her. But she had found out obviously she knew his name, she's gone to the effort of writing to the parents. So she said that he'd used very offensive language to the 7-year-old, and could we please speak to him about it and make sure it doesn't happen again. She didn't confront him with it as the teacher and verify, but that's what she did. So then we asked him, and he was incredibly upset, said it wasn't him. He had witnesses. He was playing football at the time, couldn't have been him. Okay. So then we wrote back to the teacher and then said, he says it wasn't him. He couldn't have been there. Did you stop him there and just check with him and this kid, and then you could tell 30 off, and then you could write to us? No, she hadn't done that. Turns out it was another child, mistaken identity. Bearing in mind, there are only 4 Black boys in a school of nearly 700. And this teacher hadn't bothered to go to the effort of taking this child to point out who the other child was. This child had said my son's name, and she took it as read. And I said to this teacher in an email, in the UK, across the US, there are thousands of Black men sitting in jail currently for things they didn't do, but they just had, it could have been any other Black man, but one of them has to be guilty. So it doesn't really matter if you take one off the street. And my son actually said to me, he did not want to be tainted with this accusation, because then other teachers, the first years, would be talking about him. It starts that young. And it's so, as a parent, you try so hard not to get mad. You try so hard to stay unflappable. And then you have to deal with that. It could have just been any one of them. Mistaken identity, there's 4 of them. How, this is what we deal with. So, yeah, I had to just give that anecdote so people understand that this happens every time on the nice side of town, by the way.
Thanks for sharing, Michael, and sorry that happened. We have to round up now, or around about now, but I do want to ask 2 questions and asking you both to keep it really short. The first is, so we've unpacked a lot today, and I think a lot of what we've unpacked probably needs to be unpacked some more, but we don't have the time to do that online, so maybe we'll have a 2.0 next year. But just how do you take care of your mental health? Like, how do you take care of yourself? Danny?
One of the main things that I have to do in order to take care of my mental health is to kind of like step away from the fight sometimes, right? So when you are a person of color and you are an advocate for, DEI and so on and so forth, you often are fueled by that on the regular basis, right? And you also are fueled by the stories of individuals that are encountering, racism, microaggression, so on and so forth. for me, there are days where I have to simply say, Danny, you cannot fight all the battles, and you have to kind of like put up a wall and say that today I'm not going to engage, whether it be in certain like podcasts, newsletters, so on and so forth, simply because like as much as we constantly want to be in this fight and we want to always progress and push for change, you have to take care of your mental health and be mindful of what I call burnout, where you simply are just, you can't take it anymore. And for me, I think that's extremely important. I think, taking time out to be with friends, be with family, exercise, so on and so forth, is how I take care of my mental health, is making sure that I am basically, Michael and I was talking about it earlier, was, I make sure that I recharge in order for me to then put on that armor again and fight that fight. So I think it's important to make sure that we give ourselves the opportunity to recharge by finding things that we find joy in. It could simply be going to the gym.
Thanks, Danny. Michael?
For me, I have a therapist, which has been one of the best things I've done ever. And I've also taken up meditation, because whatever I can use and try to help have some equilibrium is really important for me. I think maybe because I don't work in the D&I space explicitly, unlike Danny, I welcome the smoke. I want all the trouble. Like I'll fight the fight. I don't mind, because, and maybe it's partly because I have 2 young children, so I feel very keenly things that I don't want them to experience. It's not a judgment. It's just that way it happens to be for me. So yeah, I plug out of things that I know will gaslight me. I don't go listening to podcasts or polemicists who I know are there just to provoke. But yeah, I want all the smoke. So I want to engage, and I think that we have to have, for me, really uncomfortable conversations in order to make progress, because most people are quite thoughtful. But like I said, therapy, meditation, and finding your tribe, finding people who you can have conversations where you can pretty much say anything. That's really important. And I've found mine in the last 12 months.
Right. Thanks, Michael. And I can relate to what, the 2 of you shared. On one hand, I think I also just kind of know when to disengage. Like when I'm like, nope, not today, Sathan. I'm not going to address that, right? And then I have days where I just think, I have a child. I willingly brought a child into this. Like I have to do something, like I have to try. And, I'm raising her to be super opinionated and, feisty and cool. And someday she's going to ask me, what did you do? What did you do to try to make my life better? And I just want to be able to say, I did this and I did that and I tried and I spoke up. So for me, I almost sometimes feel like I don't have the luxury, to not do anything, because her mental health, her well-being, her sense of self, her identity depends on what I can create for her, and maybe the minds I can change, the spaces I can open up. So yeah, I struggle between both, and therapy is great. Therapists can take all my money, right? And also like spending time with people that I care about, and also just having spaces really important where you could say whatever. One of the things that I find very useful for myself as a Black person and as a person of color is like being in spaces with people of color where I don't have to explain myself. I don't have to worry about offending anybody, that I can just say something and people just get it. It's like that thing about being seen and heard. So important. I would like to just ask a final question now, and just say it's really great that both of you have shared. I can't even begin to thank you for the honesty and the vulnerability that you've brought to this conversation, and just wanting to leave people with something concrete. If we can think of just one thing, because I know you have a lot of tips, but if we think of one tip, you could share with everyone listening today, on how they could create, better and more inclusive spaces for, people of diverse races, and also spaces to foster a more positive sense of masculinity in the workplace and society at large, what would that be? So one thing, Danny, you go first.
One thing, I would say, believe people's stories. You know, do not try to undermine somebody else's experiences simply because you have had another experience. Just
Thanks.
keeping it nice and short.
That's very powerful. Thank you. Michael?
I would say don't be afraid to have conversations. So in the chat, someone used the word colored people, as opposed to people of color, and was gently reminded as to how it should be, and that's okay. That person didn't come with bad intentions, and I think that's perfectly okay. I saw a stat yesterday in America that 1 out of 7 men do not have a close friend. 1 out of 10 women do not have a close friend, which means 1 out of 7 people has no one to talk to. And so I think it's really, I've gone through some stuff personally recently where I realized I didn't talk to people, and that was a mistake. So you do not need a therapist to be able to talk to someone, but you have to have someone you can confide in. And that goes to the workplace as well. Don't be afraid of having an honest conversation and making mistakes, because we now, you know, we dox people and everything else. Like, people can be sorry, and it's okay to make a mistake. Be sorry and learn from it.
Thank you. And if I could add one tip, proximity is not lived experience. I think it ties in quite well with what Danny and Michael have said. Have conversations and believe people's stories. And the fact that you know a gay person or a Black person, you know, who has it well, or who thinks this is how it works for me, doesn't mean it's going to work that same way for somebody else who you identify under the same category. So proximity is not lived experience. And I think if you remember that, it makes a huge difference. Okay, I'm going to jump right into the questions. And given time, I'm going to flip around some of the questions that I think we have touched on. We had a question here. I think the first one was addressed to Michael. Having realized these experiences and challenges, what do you think is the impact and challenges women experience as a result of such behaviors? How do you think this translates into the work environment? And what can men, as allies for gender equality, demonstrate with this? I think maybe this touches a bit on kind of what Danny was talking about, the difference between how men experience the workplace versus how women experience the workplace. But I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add onto this quickly, Michael?
I think what Danny just said earlier, when people tell you something, believe them, and try to see where they're coming from. But as far as men go, I think we have to start having honest conversations. Like, we're able to talk about sport and cars and important things to us, I guess, but they're not really intrinsic to psyche and a sense of emotional well-being. There's nothing wrong in having these really these conversations about relationships and children and all these things. That's being brave for me, having those conversations. So I think if men start having them with each other, it makes it much easier to understand other people, where they're coming from.
Right, thank you. I have a question here from Matt. How has moving to Norway changed your relationship with race and masculinity, both personally and how you think others perceive it? Danny, you want to take this one?
When it comes to race, I do feel as though I have been a bit more relaxed when it comes to my fears, these heightened fears that I have around, you know, police brutality, you know, around safety. When it comes to, you know, the workplace, that is still a challenge. And I think that challenge, you know, encompasses many things, such as, you know, language barriers and just, you know, access, or just, you know, general connections that I may not have in order to, you know, enter these spaces. When it comes with masculinity, I think maybe that has been the hardest one, because of the fact that the homophobia that I face in Norway, I've never faced before. You know, I was born and raised in New York City. There is not a more gay city to live in than New York City. So I didn't feel very alone when it comes to how Black men express their homosexuality. What I've realized here in Norway is that there are very few Black men who are openly gay. And as a result of that, I had become a huge minority already in a minority situation. So as a gay man coming from the US who is quite open with his sexuality, I have faced a lot of, homophobia in very violent ways because of it. But I think, when it comes to, the smoke that I will allow myself to take, that is one of them. I will not silence myself. I will not cower away from that. So, my partner and I, we've had the conversation like, okay, maybe we should be less affectionate in public. And that was a decision that we had made to not, simply because of the fact that the exposure is needed, right? So if I decide to kind of like step away from the limelight of, facing these homophobic individuals, what happens is they do win and they do not have the opportunity to learn, and others around me do not have the opportunity to see that this is okay. You can be Black and gay here in Norway. So yeah, that's it. That's the one.
Thanks, Danny. The next question I have here is from Susanna. And she says, I am coming in with the idea that toxic masculinity is indoctrinated within men since day one, and it takes time and efforts to deconstruct. Do you sometimes still catch yourself perpetuating traits of toxic masculinity in certain situations? What is your reaction when you catch yourself doing that? Michael, you want to take this?
I do catch myself doing it, Susanna, and I think the key is catching yourself doing it. If you notice that you do it, then you're some way to acknowledging that that you don't want to repeat those behaviors. So then that's one of the few areas I'm happy to overcompensate. So I would try much harder to not do it. And the example I thought of straight away was, I know my father, my children's grandfather, when my son and daughter are arguing, he'll often say to my daughter, oh, no, don't fight back with your brother. Women don't, ladies don't do that. And I say to her straight away, no, ladies do that. If someone wrongs you, male or female, whatever, if you feel a certain way, answer them back, or whatever, don't do this thing where, girls don't react and men are allowed to be. And with him, my son, when he's upset and he cries, absolutely nothing wrong with it. If I felt the need, I'd cry with him. He gets the kiss. He gets the kiss on the lips, just like she does. He's not too old for that. I feel like an Italian mafioso father when I kiss my son on the lips anyway. So if you can't handle that, just say that, But seriously, yeah, I overcompensate, and I do catch myself, and it's okay, because you're right. We are indoctrinated from birth as young men, across the world. It's not just here in the West or anywhere else. So catch yourself doing it, and then pivot.
Thanks, Michael. Another question here from Susanna. Can you name some positive male role models for young boys growing up? And I'm guessing by this, she probably means like Black male role models or men of color. And I'm also quite interested in this for both Michael and Danny. I want to know, anyone you can think of to recommend? I know Susanna, she has a little boy.
So I think when it comes to individuals here in Norway, unfortunately, just like Michael said before, I do not possess any insight on that. I have not seen so many that I can speak about. I think when it comes to men from back home, today, I would say my father, simply because of his own growth. And his ability to, get past through some of his cultural boundaries and religious boundaries and his own societal thoughts and beliefs, to kind of accept me. Those are he's the role models that I go to. I go to my family. I go to my family simply because I appreciate the work the men in my family has done to now accept me authentically.
Right. Thank you. Michael?
I think here in Norway, it is difficult, but I can think of two people I've come across who I greatly admire. So there's T. Michael, who's got his own clothing brand, started in Bergen. Then now the main store is in Operagata, and they have stores in Tokyo, Paris, here in Oslo, I think London. That's no mean feat. He's of Ghanaian heritage, but he's been here, I think, 30 years, and he's someone I know, really nice person. And there's a young man, Norwegian born of East African descent, who is part of a clique of guys who run most of the big clubs here in Oslo, Yama. And he's again, really approachable, really good guy. So here at home, local, I think that's a good start. But I think the tragedy is that a lot of the people I would point to tend to be Black men, not from the countries that we live in, whether it's, I think, say, there's a man called Tijani Tiam, who was the CEO of Credit Suisse and Prudential, really large corporates. He came with a US education, was in the UK, CEO of FTSE 100 companies. Or you'd look to LeBron James, not because of what he does in sport, but because of the school, the fact that, you know, they're producing, they're buying distribution, they're producing their own things, not just playing for the man. But then also I would look to people like, I'm a big fan of James Baldwin, his writings. I think there are lots of people, unfortunately from the past maybe, but they are people that I think young Black people should know, and should read, should study. There's a lot, actually. We could talk about them. There's a lot, but here in Norway, not so many, unfortunately.
I was also thinking Denzel Washington, because he's amazing.
He is.
Yeah. Okay, next question here is from Achi. I hope I'm saying that right, Achi. About that point, people of color folks creating their own spaces. How do we help people who are not able to create their own spaces? So I guess this came in and when we're talking about, Danny had mentioned that oftentimes a lot of people of color and Black people in leadership positions have had to create their own companies and create their own spaces. And I think this person is asking, how do we help people who are not able to create their own? Any of you want to quickly speak to this?
I think for me, it's one of the reasons why I started my company, Complete Connection Consulting, is to help and support migrant workers here in Norway get access into the workforce. My main focus is to try to support individuals to get into workspaces that mirrors their skill sets, that also mirrors their education. What Michael spoke about earlier is that what we often see is that individuals who come here in Norway and they'll end up, holding positions such as like carriers, taxi drivers, more kind of like low-level positions, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when you have an individual that comes here with 3 masters and they're doing that, my hope is to help them find ways to enter jobs that are more closely related to their skills and their education. And that's how you do that. An individual like, myself or even Chisom, where you create your own space, then you support and help other individuals kind of enter similar spaces. They might not, create their own company, but at least, pushing them into getting them inside the right rooms is important.
Right. Thanks, Danny. Michael, I'm going to just move on to the next question here, which was directed at you. Michael mentioned earlier that as a minority, you feel like you need to moderate your behavior, speak less, work softer, to prevent, for example, white males from feeling self-conscious, which leads to defensive behavior. Do you have any tips for de-escalating such situations?
Wow. I think there's a issue in the question, why would we want to what are we de-escalating, the behavior of the people receiving it, or my own actions? I don't think there's much we can do for how someone perceives you if they're not open-minded. I actually think that this is two-pronged. I think that I would tell my younger self, don't shrink yourself, just be you, because you will eventually find your place, your role. And secondly, in creating our own spaces, which in some ways sometimes we're forced to do, but actually I think it's a beautiful thing now. This won't be as much of a problem, because as Chisom said earlier, the majority of the global population are not white Aryan or white European. They are people of color. And that's not to say that there's some sort of war coming. It's just the facts are. So we don't actually have to, we do not have to parrot a certain people's behavior. We do not have to please any sort of community. You treat people with humility and respect, and that's a given. But we're creating our own spaces, and you know, the arc of history bends towards the truth, and people will come along eventually. And if they choose not to, that's on them. I mean, if you look at a country like Norway, they do not have enough big enough population to do all the jobs that need to be done to take care of all the old people that are going to need to be taken care of. For example, they are going to have to increase immigration. There's no fight in it unless, you know, lots of these white people want to take care of old people and bathe them and things, for example. Not going to happen. So you can't fight reality. And if they don't bend with it, then they will lose out and very quickly fall behind.
That question triggered me positively, not in a negative way, but now I think I've had this conversation with Michael and maybe even Danny about the term minority. I mean, I've had to also reframe that for myself, because I think like that mental reframing goes a long way. Because if I see myself in a country like Norway, where there are 5 million of us, because I'm also a Norwegian citizen, it's so easy to ascribe to the term minority, right? But then am I a minority in Nigeria, where there are 200 million of us? I am the majority of the majority in that context. And if you actually look at the world is majority non-white people. And I think sometimes when we single out, and of course I'm still working through this, so this is not any scholarly thoughts, but you know, when we single out whiteness as a lack of color, we also separate it in a way, because white people also have color, right? And then just like trying to reframe what that is, seeing myself as I am rather than a minority, has been very impactful and something that I'm still processing, because it also helps me remove that mindset of what I am expected to have as a person of minority background, where I actually come from, if we just put it directly, if I come from a global majority. And I think when you conceptualize it like that, it kind of hits differently to see that whiteness is actually the minority from a global perspective. We have a few minutes left here. I'm just trying to see if I have any additional questions, and I am so sorry if I have missed any questions that have come in. No, it doesn't seem that way. I think I missed something. Oh, there is a comment. So I can go through comments. A comment from Stan. It may come with a surprise to see how many of these aspects you've mentioned today resonates in real life and work environments in countries of Central Europe. For example, Poland, where people are in their majority homogeneous, one nation whites. And Christopher also said he wanted to add, I assume is a he, wanted to add the Norwegian artist Abdul Hakim Hassane, I hope I'm not destroying somebody's name, and Mira as great role models. I think like on the topic of role models, it's quite important to have more visibility. And I think Michael mentioned, or maybe Danny talked about, just that representation matters, you know, have that visibility. I saw something around, you know, the phrase, you can't be what you can't see. And somebody said, you can't be what you can't seek. And I think to even know that you can seek something, you have to know that it is accessible and reachable. And sometimes it's difficult to do so. Okay, I see I have one private question here. So 1 second. Oof. Okay, this is to Danny and Michael and to myself. So continuing with white accept, I don't think we have enough time for this, but continuing with white acceptability and proximity to whiteness in the workplace. What does this word mean to you, and how have you been challenged by, navigated, or benefited from it? Do any of you want to just answer quickly? Do you benefit from proximity to whiteness? And this could be not necessarily your skin color, but like how you dress, how you speak. Yeah.
I was gonna say the exact same thing. I think sometimes we think about proximity to whiteness simply based on the color of our skin, but we fail to understand that also means the way that you talk, how educated you are, and even financial, like how much money you have. I think I have benefited from proximity to whiteness when it comes to the way that I speak and the education that I do have. And, you know, there's both good and bad about it. You know, it's good that I'm able to enter these spaces and therefore make room for individuals like myself to come on after me. But there's also that pressure of maintaining a certain behavior and attitude in order for individuals to then come after me. So, you know, this is a deep question. And, you know, even when we talked about it earlier, there was not enough time to kind of like dive into it. So I would say, yes, we have benefited. I have benefited. But what I will say is, you know, what I try to do is use my own access to allow others to have access.
Right. And I think Michael and I can probably relate to that in terms of like where we benefit and the importance of creating space or bringing other people into the room as well, which is quite important. I do want to take this time to just say thank you to each and everyone who's been a part of this, both here on Zoom and also on LinkedIn, because I know we have people who are watching live on there. Really appreciate the time that you, you spend, you know, listening to us talk about these topics. We value your time, and, you know, 2 hours is a long time to ask. And thank you so very much for being here. I want to say thank you to Danny and Michael. This has been a raw, honest, soul-crushing conversation. So thank you for showing up as you are. Thank you for speaking so honestly and authentically. Really appreciate it. I know these are really difficult conversations to have. And just as a listener, it's also quite heavy. So thank you for just doing this and so graciously. And to all the participants, yeah, really appreciate your time. Just, I don't know if Danny and Michael want to say any last words before we close up, but, and also please join the next event, which I think happens on the 14th or 16th of December. But yeah, Danny, Michael, any last words? We're shutting down in 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think I will reiterate a lot of what you just said. Simply thank you, especially for the participants, for allowing yourself to come into these conversations and listen to some of these conversations in order to better understand and go forth with a higher awareness. And I do hope that I was able to share some powerful insights that will, you know, shape the way that you see the future, or simply the way that you see colleagues and friends in the future.
Yeah, I just want to follow on from that. I co-sign all of that. And thanks everyone for turning up. I thank you, Chisom, for inviting me onto this. And also anyone listening, feel free to reach out, LinkedIn or however, if you want to.
Can you drop your LinkedIn links onto the chat so people can connect with you? It's easier than having to go find, you know, the other Danny Pierre-Louis online.
Yes, I will. Yes, I will definitely do that.
This has been fun. Thank you all. This has been really great. I mean, I was so excited and also kind of like nervous for this conversation because it's a big one. And yeah, thank you both for handling it with such finesse.